الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We know that when we send our salams to our imams, they can hear our salam and they do respond to our salam. And they respond to us by inspiring our hearts and increasing the faith within our hearts. So let us join together as we begin tonight's program by sending our salams to Imam al-Hussein. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. Alayka minni salamullah أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Last night we said that reform in any community must begin by reforming their values, reforming their beliefs, and reforming how they look at the world that is around them. We also pointed out last night that it is our beliefs and our values that produce our practices. To be exact, those practices are natural for us, which align with our beliefs and with our values. And if they don't align with our beliefs and values, then those practices become unnatural for us. I gave you the example of the cow and the fact that they are not slaughtered in India to demonstrate that point. Because the people in India, in particular the Hindu community, one of their beliefs is that cows are reincarnations of dead souls, then it becomes very unnatural for them to slaughter a cow. But for a community that does not believe in that, and we don't believe that cows are reincarnations of dead souls, then to say that we cannot slaughter a cow, that becomes unnatural for us. The reason why I made this point is to say that, for example, if somebody is raised in a hedonistic culture, a culture which teaches him that the purpose to life is to acquire as much pleasure as you can, then the restrictions imposed by the Sharia will become unnatural for him. And if a person is raised with the belief of a Tawheedi culture, where he is taught that his purpose in life is to go closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the restrictions of the Sharia become very natural for him. We also said last night that as a Muslim community, we are not allowed to develop a defeatist culture. That we should not say to ourselves that we cannot change our beliefs and we cannot change our values, and therefore we must change our practices. To the contrary, we must change our beliefs and values so that they align with the practices which are expected from us. Now, last night I also started to talk about an important principle, and that is the principle of Tawheed. And we said last night that, look, Tawheed is not just a theory. It's not just a belief that we have. But Tawheed, when it's understood correctly, has implications. It has implications in our ethical life. It has implications in our practices. Tawheed is in fact a way of living life. It is a lifestyle. It governs our social structures as well. And today, we want to start looking at that. But we made one more point last night that I want you to pay attention to. We said last night that we want to organize our societies in the manner in which God has created them. God has created everything in a particular manner. This is known as the fitrah of that thing. فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. The word fitrah in the Arabic language means khilqah, the manner of creating something. Just as God has created every human being in a particular manner, you find that God has also created nature and human society in a particular manner. We want to run our societies in a manner that is natural to their fitrah. Okay? So we notice that God has put diversity in the world of creation. And you begin to see this diversity in the world of nature. In nature, there is a lot of diversity. When you come to the world of insects, they tell us there are at least 900,000 different recorded species of insects. And within each species, there is great diversity as well. When you come to the world of birds, 10,000 species which have been recorded and 22,000 subspecies within them. When you come to the sea creatures, there are at least 28,000 different species of fish and other sea creatures. Now you find diversity in nature. Biologists point out that wherever you see there is genetic diversity, that particular species has a greater chance of survival. If you find genetic diversity within an organism, then the chances that it will have the attributes and the traits which are required to survive in a particular environment are greater for that species, and therefore its chances of survival are even greater. What does that teach us? It teaches us that when you look at diversity in nature, it is not a source of weakness within nature. To the contrary, it is a source of strength and a basis for survival. God has also created diversity within human society. He created us in pairs as men and women. He created us in stages. And so in our community, we have people who are young and we have people who are old. Wa alaykum as-salam. We also have cultural diversity within human society. And that is what I want to talk about today. In Surah Al-Hujarat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses mankind. Sometimes God addresses the believers. And so He says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. But sometimes He addresses all of mankind. Ya ayyuhan nas. Inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. We have created you from one man and one woman. You see, these verses of the Quran, they have to be understood in the context in which they were revealed. Back during the time of the Holy Prophet and before the coming of the Prophet, people would take pride in their parents and where they came from. Somebody would introduce himself by saying, I am the son of so-and-so, who is the son of so-and-so. And the person who is his counterpart would respond by saying, and I am Fulan bin Fulan. They would take pride in that. And so God is saying to them that if you are going to take pride in that, then you should know that all of humanity, whether they're black or white, Arab or Persian, they all come from one man and from one woman. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. We have made you into shu'ub. Shu'ub is the plural of sha'ab. Sha'ab refers to a group of people that have gathered in one land, a nation. وَقَبَائِل. Qaba'il is the plural of qabila. In every nation you will find there are different tribes. There are different subsets of people. Now why has God put us into nations and tribes, into different cultures? So again, we have to understand this segment of the verse in the context in which it was revealed. There's actually a story to the revelation of this verse. We're told in the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet of Allah, he entered the city of Mecca. And the day he entered, and the Muslim army entered Masjidul Haram, it was the time for Dhuhr prayer. The Prophet asked Bilal to climb on top of the Kaaba itself and to pronounce the adhan from the top of the Kaaba. And so Bilal went, and on top of the Kaaba he was pronouncing the adhan. One of the mushrikeen who was there, who had not yet accepted Islam, he said that I am glad that my forefathers are not alive on this day. Because if they were alive, they would have seen a black slave climbing on top of the very Kaaba. And he also added to that to say, couldn't this man, meaning the Holy Prophet, find a person other than this? Now you'll pardon my language, but that is the language that's there, historically speaking, other than this black crow. When he had said this, these were the verses of the Quran that were revealed. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. If you come from different nations and you come from different tribes, it is only because you get to know each other. You get to introduce each other. It doesn't give you a status. It doesn't give you honor or dignity. If you want honor or dignity, إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. That only comes with taqwa. Now there is a point that I want to glean away from this verse. And that point is the fact that God has put us into different cultures and into different nations. And He has done that for a purpose. And it serves a worldly purpose. It serves no purpose in the hereafter. When the angel of death comes to you, he will care less whether you come from India or from Canada, you come from America or from South Africa. But it does serve a worldly purpose, and a very important worldly purpose. Therefore you find, when the early Muslims became Muslims, they were not expected to lose their cultural identity. Islam did not ask them to lose their culture or to stop their cultural expressions. In fact, to the contrary, Islam encouraged it, because cultural diversity is an important part of human society. Even the Prophet of Allah himself, he primarily introduced himself as a Muslim, but sometimes he would also introduce himself as a Qurayshi. We're told in the Battle of Hunayn, in the Battle of Hunayn, the numbers were very different from the Battle of Badr. In the Battle of Badr, Muslims were 313 in number, their enemies were in 1,000. Muslims were very humble in the presence of God. In the Battle of Hunayn, their numbers were 12,000 and their enemies were 4,000. So they had overconfidence in themselves. They had misplaced confidence. And in the middle of the battle, they started to run away from the battlefield, just as they had done in the Battle of Uhud. At that time, we're told the Prophet of Allah stood on top of a height at an elevated place, and from there he was calling the Muslims to come back towards him. But how was he calling to them? He said, أَنَا النَّبِيُّ لَا كَذِبْ أَنَا ابْنُ عَبْدِ الْمُطَّلِبِ. Right? I'm a prophet, and that's not a lie. I'm calling you as a prophet of God, and I'm also the son of Abdul Muttalib. He associated himself with Abdul Muttalib and with the tribe of Quraysh as well. And therefore you find in Islam, it encourages cultural expression and says there's no problem in belonging to a particular culture. Obviously within its limitations, within its restrictions as well. Right? Cultural expressions and cultural pride is acceptable as long as it does not lead to prejudice. What is known in Arabic as asabiyya. Sometimes a person says, I'm better than the other person because I belong to this culture and he belongs to that culture. By the way, this discussion that we're having is not just limited to culture. It's also applying to nationalism as well. I belong to this nation and he belongs to that nation. I will help him because he comes from my nation, and I will not help them because they don't come from my nation. Sometimes this cultural pride also leads to dogmatism. The idea that I'm going to accept something, a concept or a practice, because it comes from my culture, and I'm not going to be critical of it, and I'm going to criticize another practice or another concept because it comes from another culture. Islam says that if your cultural pride leads you to prejudice or it leads you to dogmatism, then that is asabiyya, and there is no room in Islam for asabiyya. There's a hadith, a very beautiful hadith. And I know that this hadith is a hadith which is sahih. This hadith is one narrated by Imam Khomeini rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh in his book 40 Hadith. Now there's something special about this book 40 Hadith. When he narrates a hadith in this book, he's not saying that I'm narrating this hadith from this particular book. When he narrates a hadith in that book, all the 40 ahadith that he has, he says, I narrate this hadith because I heard it from my teacher, who heard it from his teacher, who heard it from his teacher. He takes it verbally all the way back to the Imam. Okay? So you know that this hadith is a valid hadith. In this hadith, it goes back to the sixth Imam, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi afdalu salati wa salam. He says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله من كان. So this hadith is now from the Prophet of Allah. من كان في قلبه حبة من خردل من عصبية. Whoever in his heart has a mustard seed of prejudice, of asabiyya, what will happen to him in the hereafter? بعثه الله يوم القيامة مع أعراب الجاهلية. On the day of judgment, God will not raise him with the Muslims. On the day of judgment, God will raise him with the Bedouin Arabs from the time of Jahiliyyah, and he will be held accountable along with them. Now, what you also see within our Sharia is that our Sharia itself encourages cultural expressions and allows cultural expressions to flourish. In fact, our Sharia encourages human creativity and allows creativity to flourish. We sometimes have a very wrong conception of our Sharia. We think of it as a limiting force. To the contrary, the Sharia is a very liberating force. Now, our Sharia is divided into two parts, and the ahkam are of two types. One part of our Sharia deals with ibadat, acts of worship. Prayer and fasting and hajj and i'tikaf fall under this category. There's a second part of our Sharia which deals with mu'amalat, human interaction and human expressions, business transactions, leasing, gifting, marriage, divorce, conflicts between two people, relationship between nations. These all fall under mu'amalat, interactions. It is interesting to note that the principles that apply to acts of worship are different from those foundational principles that apply to human interaction. When it comes to acts of worship, the Sharia plays a constructive role, meaning the Sharia itself will define acts of worship. As human beings, we're not allowed to create our own acts of worship. Meaning a person cannot say that I have created a 5 rak'ah prayer and this is the thawab of performing that prayer. You cannot do that. Anytime somebody claims that this is an act of ibadah or an act of worship, the burden of proof is on him. He has to prove through evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah that this is in fact an act of worship. You cannot insert acts of worship. I'll give you an example of this. For example, in our adhan, a majority of our scholars, in fact almost all of our scholars, and Maraji of Taqleed will tell you that reciting Ashhadu Anna Aliyan Waliyullah is not a part of the adhan, because there is no evidence for that from the Quran or the Sunnah. If you recite it, then you recite it with the intention that it is not a part of the adhan. And if you do that with the intention that it is a part of the adhan, then that, even Sayyid Al-Khu'i will tell you, is not permissible. Now, to allay your concerns, I also recite it as well. Okay. Before we get worked up, I recite it as well. But you see, the point is that you have to have evidence for it before you make it a part of the Sharia, which is very different than when you look at the mu'amalat, human expressions and human interaction. There, the principle is completely inverted. Everything is permissible. Human creativity is allowed to flourish. If you want to say that something is haram, you have to bring evidence for why it is haram. Okay? Everything is halal and permissible unless you have evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah that this is certainly something which is not permissible. It's unfortunate that some members of the Muslim community, a segment of the Muslim community, has not understood this. So every time you try to do something new, immediately they will tell you it is bid'ah, wal bid'ah dalala, wal dalala fin nar. Right? This is something that's leading astray, and that goes to the fire of hell. So one day a man came to a sheikh and he told him before the Eid khutbah that today I have brought some toys. And after the Eid khutbah, I will be distributing these toys. So, O Shaykh, when you give the Eid sermon, then just announce to the people that Fulan is outside near his car and children should go to him and he will be distributing toys on the day of Eid. So the Shaykh went and in his sermon he made that announcement that outside somebody is distributing toys. A man stood up, very agitated. He said, Ya Shaykh, this is an act of bid'ah. During the time of Rasulullah, they did not used to distribute toys on the day of Eid. Therefore, this is dalala and what dalala fin nar. This person failed to understand that when it comes to human expressions, and joy is a human expression, you don't need evidence from the time of Rasulullah that this is permissible. You need evidence from the Prophet or the Quran or the Ahlul Bayt that this is not permissible. You see that even our Sharia allows for the expression of human creativity. Therefore, you will rarely find that the Sharia touches on cultural practices. Culture plays a role in human society. Religion plays another role in human society. They don't play the same role. Rarely will religion come and touch upon cultural practices. But sometimes it does. And it only does that because sometimes our cultural practices, they are based on values and beliefs which are contrary to the values and beliefs of the Sharia. Now, one thing I have to be clear over here is that I have not defined for you what culture means. And you'll find that in the English language, there is no word like culture which has so many definitions. Even the lexicographers, they have a difference of opinion on what is the definition of culture. But we'll go with a very basic definition for today. Cultural expressions, like the way we dress, the food that we eat, the way we express joy, the way we express sorrow, the way we greet each other. These kinds of cultural expressions. Sometimes, yes, the Sharia will come and restrict these expressions. There's an example in the Nahj al-Balagha, hadith number 37 from the short sayings. So we're told in this hadith that our first Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi afdalus salati was salam, وقال عليه السلام, he said, now I'll read the Arabic out for you as well. وقد لقيه عند مسيره إلى الشام دحاقين الأنبار فترجلوا له واشتدوا بين يديه. He was traveling towards Syria and he was going through Iraq. And he passed through a city or a town called Anbar. And there the villagers of Anbar came to greet him and to bid him farewell as well. And as he was leaving, they got off their mounts and they started running in front of him in a manner that was not befitting for them, that was humiliating and debasing for them. It's important for us to think about this hadith, especially in light of some of the rituals of commemoration that we have in the Shia world. And we have to ask ourselves that some of these rituals, are they truly pleasing to the Imam or are they not pleasing to him? If I humiliate and debase myself, am I pleasing the Imam or am I not pleasing the Imam? So they did that for him. When he saw that, in the hadith it is said, he said, فَقَالَ مَا هَذَا الَّذِي صَنَعْتُمُوهُ? What is this that you are doing? What sort of practice is this? Which was a part of their culture. فَقَالُوا, they say to him, خُلُقٌ مِنَّا نُعَظِّمُ بِهِ أُمَرَاءَنَا. This is a part of our cultural practice. This is how we revere our leaders and our chiefs. Now listen to the answer of the Imam. This is a point where religion comes and starts directing culture. The Imam said to him, وَاللَّهِ مَا يَنْتَفِعُ بِهَذَا أُمَرَاءَكُمْ. By God, your leaders, none of them benefited by you running in front of them and debasing yourself in front of them. وَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَشُقُّونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ فِي دُنْيَاكُمْ. You're only creating hardship for yourself in this world and wretchedness for yourself in the hereafter. And then the Imam says, وَمَا أَخْسَرَ الْمَشَقَّةَ وَرَاءَهَا الْإِقَابِ. What a loss is that hardship after which comes punishment. وَأَرْبَحَ الدَّعَةَ مَعَهَا الْأَمَانُ مِنَ النَّارِ. And what a profit is that calling and that practice which brings about safety from the fire of hell. So let's recap what we have said. We have said that God has created human beings with cultural diversity. This cultural diversity is a source of strength for human society, and it gives survival to them. We also pointed out that as long as it does not lead to prejudice and does not lead to dogmatism, Islam does not refrain you and prevent you from having a particular culture. We also say that when you look at the Sharia does not limit human creativity or cultural expressions. To the contrary, the Sharia allows it to flourish unless there is a reason for limiting it. So, having said that, I want you to ponder and reflect over our communities. Why is it that we lack cultural diversity in most of our Shia communities? Today, when you go to any city in North America, most of the time you will find that community centers are built along cultural lines. There is a Shia Khoja community, which is separate from a Shia Pakistani community, which is separate from a Shia Iraqi community, from an Iranian community, from a Lebanese community, from an Afghan community, from other communities. Why don't we have that cultural diversity within our centers? Sometimes you find that even in those cities, within the same culture, you have cultural centers being built along tribal lines. Or for example, since we come from this city and you come from that city, therefore we're going to have two different centers. And having a cultural center, there's no problem in it per se. But you also find that within these cultural centers, there is no communication. There is no dialogue. There is no cooperation. There is no collaboration. Right? No, cooperation and collaboration is not just about meeting each other. We talked about this 2 years ago. We say don't ever think that a community is brick and mortar and a ceiling and walls. No, a community is when two human beings or a few human beings are actually related to each other, either through marriage or through business transactions or through one commitment or another commitment. We don't see that. Now, when that is lacking in the Shia community, it unfortunately exposes weaknesses in the Shia community. It deprives us of our growth. It deprives us of establishing ourselves, one. It deprives us of having a comprehensive view of the religion, two. It also deprives us of the ability to overcome the challenges that we are facing in modern society, three. Now, these are the three things I want to talk about. Now, I'm going to be a little self-critical, and it's okay to be self-critical. That is the only way that we are going to grow, inshaAllah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. First, we don't have anymore the ability to confront common issues and common challenges. The Prophet of Allah took advantage of cultural diversity for the survival of the Muslim community. One of the best examples that we have is the Battle of Ahzab. In the Battle of Ahzab, an army of 10,000 strong was marching towards Medina, and their aim was to destroy the Muslim community. The Prophet of Allah, his army, topped at most at 3,000 people. So the Prophet gathered his companions. And the Prophet always made use of the diversity of cultural experiences. He tapped into that. Okay? So he gathered them and he said, how can we defend Medina? And on that day, it turned out that Salman was also a part of that gathering. And Salman said, well, I come from Iran. And in Iran, sometimes when we were faced with these battles, we would dig a trench. And so they dug a trench. And they protected the Muslim community. Do you see how the Prophet of Allah tapped into the collective intellect and the cultural experiences? Well, today, we're also facing challenges. Assimilation is not a challenge that one culture is facing. All Muslim communities are facing that. Islamophobia is not something that one community is facing. All Muslim communities are facing that. And let's not underestimate Islamophobia. Just because it doesn't affect me or you directly does not mean that it's not a problem. You see, the goal of Islamophobia is not to carry out violence against Muslims. The goal of Islamophobia is not to deport Muslims. The goal of Islamophobia is also not to discriminate against Muslims. The goal of Islamophobia is to create the threat of violence, the threat of discrimination, the threat of deportation. The goal of Islamophobia is to make a Muslim uncomfortable in being a Muslim. A Muslim not to be proud as a Muslim. For a Muslimah to think twice before she wears her hijab, and for a Muslim man to think twice before he prays in public. That's the goal of Islamophobia. Can you say that that is not something that affects us? And what surprises me are the solutions that we present. And some of these solutions come from reputable organizations. We're facing a systemic problem called Islamophobia. And yet the solution that we give is to say that we can overcome Islamophobia only by individual ethics and etiquettes. As individuals, we should be good people. Why? Because we have a hadith. A hadith that says, كُونُوا دُعَاةً لِلنَّاسِ بِغَيْرِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ. Right? Call people towards our faith without using your speech. But have you ever wondered in what context was that hadith said? That hadith was said in a context of taqiyya, in a context where the Shia community could not even form a community, let alone form alliances between community. At a time when Shias did not have political clout, they could not become a social force. Then their responsibility came down to individual responsibility. Can we say today that it is only an individual responsibility? Or is confronting Islamophobia a collective responsibility? A responsibility that as a community and as communities, we have to overcome it. Okay. If it's a collective responsibility, my question to you is, how are we going to overcome it when we're so fragmented along cultural lines? When we're intellectually, financially, and even in terms of human resources, so fragmented in our cities. That's one. The second weakness that it exposes within the Shia community is we begin to see our religion from the lens of one culture only. And that gives us a very myopic view of our religion, a very narrow understanding of the religion. Now this is where I get into trouble, so bear with me. Sometimes we have religious practices within our culture that have no religious basis. And then there are religious practices which have a religious basis, but they're not a part of our culture. So let's start with a simple example. When somebody becomes sick, immediately go to the program organizer and you tell him, today I'd like you to recite 5 times Amma yujibu, right? Because that is going to make that person better. So that turns out actually to be a cultural practice. It has no religious basis to it. You will not find a single hadith, even an unauthentic hadith, that says recite Amma yujibu when somebody is sick. I'm not saying that we should stop reciting it. We can recite it. Inshallah, people will get better when we do recite it. But just to know that there is no hadith to that effect. In fact, Amma yujibu is not even a dua. It is a question. It's a su'al. أَإِلَهُكُمْ خَيْرٌ أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. Are these false gods in which you believe better? Or is the one who answers the call of the distress and removes his grief, is he better? Okay. On the other hand, we do have a hadith that when somebody is sick, to make him better, you should recite Suratul Fatiha. But my God, if you went and recited Suratul Fatiha when somebody is sick, you would be in a lot of trouble. Okay. Now, sometimes, more seriously, you find that we take cultural concepts and we turn them into religious concepts. Anytime we want an acceptance for a cultural concept, the easiest way is to make it a religious concept, right? The Taliban, when they wanted to deny women the right to education, immediately they turned it into a religious concept. Our understanding of shaitan, which is a cultural concept most of the time, we turn it into religious concepts. Sometimes we take our cultural concepts and we impose them upon our religion. Okay? For example, in some of our cultures, the relationship between a mother and her son is a very sacred relationship. And one of the aspirations that every mother has is to see her first son or her young son getting married, right? That is important in our cultures. So we take that concept and we impose it upon Karbala. And when we look at the relationship between the mother of Qasim and Hadrat Qasim, we only see it from the perspective of that cultural lens. That's the only thing we take away from that relationship. Okay? And sometimes we think that by doing this, we're doing a favor to the tragedy of Karbala. What we don't realize is we're taking culturally bound concepts and imposing them upon a universal movement. And what we're doing is that universal movement now becomes a culturally bound movement. It's no longer a universal movement. When you look in the books of history, there is not a single tradition in any authentic narration of history that the mother of Qasim ever desired on the night of Ashura, on the day of Ashura, on the days after Ashura, to see her son getting married. She had only one aspiration, that he fall bravely and valiantly on the battlefield and he give his life in protecting Al-Hussein and protecting Islam. But I would have continued to accept that cultural concept and impose it upon Karbala if I had not come across different cultures. Cultures wherein we saw mothers who sent their children to the battlefront to protect the community and to protect the nation. War is not glorious. War is not great. But when war is imposed and people go to the battlefront and they give their lives, every nation takes pride in its martyrs, right? And they sent their children to the battlefront, and when the children were brought back, they were happy that their children gave their lives, and they said, we wish we had more children that we could send to the battlefront. When you see that in the mothers of this society, of this era, shall we say, right? Then what do you expect from the mothers who are there in Karbala? Don't you expect greater aspirations from them? But sometimes we take that and we apply it over there. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In fact, you'll find that our problems are even deeper than that. Okay? And I really want you to reflect upon our communities. Sometimes in certain communities and certain Husayniyas, you will find that certain discussions become a highlight of their discussions, a highlight of their speeches, a highlight of their poetry, which have absolutely no relevance to the current political situation, the current social situation. They have no relevance to modern societies. And that happens when we live in cultures which only have tolerance for a singular culture. Okay? What we do is that we take those discussions which were relevant in one era and one time because of those social political circumstances, and we drag that baggage and we bring it into this era as well, even though they're not relevant in this era. So in some communities, when you go there, you will see that polemical debates between Shia and Sunnah, who is right and who is wrong, is still the highlight of their discussion. We're not saying that these discussions are not important. We're not even saying that the discussion on wilaya is not important. I guess the question we're asking is this the most important discussion for us to have in our social political context here? Or is this the best manner for us to be talking about wilaya? in the lens of that social, political context. Right? It doesn't make sense for us to talk about it in this day and age. Does it make sense for us to talk about these polemical differences at a time when it doesn't matter whether we are Shia or Sunnah, we are facing the same challenges? We're both in the same boat. We're both facing the same issues. Doesn't it make more sense for us to talk about those things which are more relevant for us? And like that, we bring over political fault lines. We bring over ideological differences which made sense in other countries but don't make sense in this country, which made sense in a particular era, but they don't make sense in this era, only because we're a culture that tolerates a singular culture. Now, I'm not saying that simply by having multiculturalism that this sort of attitude is going to go away. But when we have that, it does expose this weakness. It does expose this particular weakness. And if we had a cultural exchange, we would stop seeing the religion from a myopic perspective. We would see the religion in a more comprehensive perspective. We would come to realize that no, this is just an issue which was important for our culture. It's not important for other cultures. Right? It's not something which is part of the universal message of Islam, an eternal message of Islam. And the third one, I'll be very brief with this, is when we have cultures and communities, which are tolerant to singular cultures, we lose our ability to establish ourselves in this part of the world. You see, when you have communities along cultural lines, people from the Hoja community, the Pakistani community, the Indian community, the Iraqi, Iranian, Afghan community, they all have a community to go to. But let me ask you one thing. What about the revert community? We have failed in integrating the revert community. You have African Americans, you have Caucasians, members of the Hispanic and Latino community who actually revert to Islam, but they have no place to go to. They have no center that will cater to them. We need to have, we're not saying that all cultures should assimilate into a singular culture. Let's be clear about that. What we are saying is that our communities should allow for a diversity of cultural expressions. In fact, and I'll end with this, the problem is even deeper than that. You see, even in our own cultures, there are cultural fissures being created. When we moved here many years ago, for many of us, we thought to ourselves that, look, I'm going to use one example. I come from India, for example. So I am an Indian who's going to live here for a short period of time until I finish my studies and I'll go back to my country. And time passed. And after a while, we realized that no, for whatever reason, it wasn't convenient for us to go back to our countries. So our mindset changed. And I say that I'm an Indian who's now going to be residing in this part of the world. I'm an Indian who's made North America his home. And then time passed. And a very important change happened in the mindset of the young Muslim. The transformation that happened there is he said, I am an American. I am a Canadian who's living in this part of the world. Then you find when this young man, whose parents come from a traditional culture, comes into our community, he doesn't find it relevant to him. He doesn't find it welcoming to him because his culture is different from the culture to which he comes to. And as long as our communities continue to be communities which are only tolerant to a singular culture, this person and the reverts and the minorities who are marginalized within the Shia community will never find a place to go to. And then how will we establish ourselves in this land? So what have we said towards the end? What we have said is not cultural assimilation. It's cultural diversity. And we need to have this cultural diversity so that we are collectively able to overcome common challenges. We need cultural diversity because it gives us a broader and more comprehensive understanding of our faith. And we need cultural diversity because it is what is going to help us establish ourselves in this part of the world. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We take our hearts now to Karbala. It's the Karbala of Imam al-Hussein. And tonight we wish we were Bain al-Haramain, between the Haram of Abbas and Hussein. But let's take our hearts over there and let us do tawassul to Imam al-Hussein. Join me in reciting it. Ya Aba Abdillah, Ya Hussein ibn Ali, أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا، يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله، يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. It is narrated when Imam al-Hussein was 2 stations away from Kufa, the army of Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyahi confronted the army of Imam al-Hussein. When Imam al-Hussein saw Hur, he asked him, Alana am alayna? Are you with us on this day, or are you against us on this day? And Hur said to him, Rather, I am against you on this day. So Imam mounted his horse, and they started to move along. And the army of Hur stopped them again. And the Imam said to him, O Hur, what do you intend with your actions? Thakalatka ummuk, may your mother weep over you. At that time Hur said to him, O Hussein, had it been any other Arab, I would also have said the same thing to him. But how can I say that to you when you are the son of Zahra? You are the son of Fatima. So Imam al-Hussein said to him, then allow me to proceed in a direction different from the direction of Kufa. And Hur allowed him to do that. But after a day or two, a messenger came to Hur, and he brought a letter from Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. And Ubaydullah said to him, O Hur, ja'ji' bil Hussein, confront al-Hussein, and do not allow him to settle in any place, except in a place where there is no water, and a place where there is no shelter for al-Hussein. And so finally Imam al-Hussein settled in the plains of Karbala on the 2nd day of Muharram. At that time, Imam al-Hussein, it is said, he stood up and he addressed his companions and he gave them a fiery speech. And in that speech he said to them, أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنَّ الْحَقَّ لَا يُعْمَلُ بِهِ? Do you not see that the truth is not acted upon? وَأَنَّ الْبَاطِلَ لَا يُتَنَاهَى عَنْ? And don't you see that falsehood is not prevented? لِيَرْغَبَ الْمُؤْمِنُ فِي لِقَاءِ اللَّهِ. A believer should desire there to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said some very famous words. He said, إِنِّي لَا أَرَى الْمَوْتَ إِلَّا سَعَادَةً وَالْحَيَاةَ مَعَ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا بَرَمًا. I do not see death except as felicitation, and life with oppression as nothing but humiliation. And he asked his companions, are you going to stand with me, or are you going to leave me? And one by one they say to him, where shall we go after you, O Hussein? How shall we desert you, O Hussein? What face will we show to Rasulullah? What face will we show to Lady Fatima Zahra? So Imam al-Hussein camped in the land of Karbala. Day by day, Hur saw the enemies of Imam al-Hussein were gathering around him. He saw that they had encircled him. They forced him to move away from the water of Furat. Hur saw the family of Imam al-Hussein suffering. He could hear the children crying. He could hear them crying for water. They were saying, Al-Atash, Al-Atash. And then on the day of Ashura, Hur saw the enemies had surrounded Imam al-Hussein. And no one was coming to the aid of Imam al-Hussein. At some point during the day, he heard a voice coming out from the camp of Imam al-Hussein. The Imam was calling out, وَهُوَ يُنَادِي أَمَا مِن نَاصِرٍ يَنْصُرُنَا أَمَا مِن مُغِيثٍ يُغِيثُنَا لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ أَمَا مِن ذَابٍ يَذُبُّ عَنْ حَرَمِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. Is there anyone to help us? Is there anyone to aid us? Is there anyone to protect the family of Rasulullah? Hur started to tremble. He went to Umar ibn Sa'ad and he said to him, أَمُقَاتِلٌ أَنْتَ هَذَا الرَّجُلُ. Are you going to fight against this man? Umar ibn Sa'ad said to him, Wallah, indeed I'm going to fight against him. The fight will be so severe. The easiest moment will be when the heads are separated from the bodies. Hur started to tremble. He came back to his camp. He was walking back and forth. Suddenly he started walking towards the camp of Imam al-Hussein. He took his horse towards the camp of Imam al-Hussein. Somebody asked him at that time, أَتُرِيدُ أَن تَحْمِلْ. Do you wish to attack the camp of al-Hussein? فَسَكَتَ. Hur did not say anything to him. But he could see that Hur was trembling, Hur was shaking, Hur was regretting. The man said to him, if somebody asked me who is the bravest warrior in this army, I would have said it is you, O Hur. Then how come I see you trembling and shaking? Hur said to him, إني أخير نفسي بين الجنة والنار. I have to choose between paradise and hellfire. والله لا أختار على الجنة شيئا ولو أحرقت. And by Allah, I shall not choose anything over paradise, even if I am burnt alive. Then the narrator says, ثم ضرب جواده نحو الحسين. And then he rode towards Imam al-Hussein. منكسا رمحا. He put down his spear. وقد طأطأ برأسه حياء من آل رسول الله. His head was shaking. His head was bowed down. He was embarrassed in front of Imam al-Hussein. He was embarrassed in front of the family of Rasulullah بما أتى إليهم وجعجع بهم في هذا المكان, because he knew he was the one who brought them to that land. And he slowly came close to Imam al-Hussein, taking short steps towards Imam al-Hussein. And he was making dua. He was reciting it loudly. The narrator says, وَهُوَ رَافِعًا صَوْتًا. He was raising his voice and he was saying, اللهم إليك أنيب فتب علي. Oh Allah, I turn repentant to you. Then I ask you to forgive me. I am the one who created fear in the children of Rasulullah. I am the one who scared your friends, O Allah. And then he came to Imam al-Hussein and he said to the Imam, Ya Aba Abdillah, inni taibun فهل لي من توبة. Oh Hussein, I seek forgiveness from you. Is there any way that you would forgive me? Is there any way you would overlook my sins? At this moment we turn to Imam al-Hussein. Ya Aba Abdillah, even we have committed sin. sins. Even we have made mistakes. We ask you to intercede by Allah. Imam al-Hussein immediately forgave Hur, and he said to him, you are forgiven. Hur said to the Imam, I ask you to allow me to go to the battlefield. I want to be the first one to be martyred. He went to the battlefield. He gave them a sermon. They would not heed his voice. They would not heed his call. He fought bravely on the day of Ashura. He finally fell to the plains of Karbala. He called out to Imam al-Hussein, Assalamu alayk, ya Aba Abdillah. These are the last salams of Hur to you, O Hussein. The narrator says, Imam al-Hussein came to him. He sat down next to Hur. He removed the blood from his face. He removed the sand from his face. He took the head of Hur, and then he said to him, Anta hurran kama sammatka ummuk, hurran fi dunya wal akhirah. You are a free man, just the way your mother has named you. You are free in this world and in the hereafter. I will say, oh Hur, how lucky you are. You fell on the day of Ashura, and Imam al-Hussein was there to take you. But remember that moment on the day of Ashura, when the son of Zahra fell to the plains of Karbala, and there was no one to come to his aid. Everyone came out to attack him. Every spear came out. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. O Allah, we pray to you for the sake of Imam al-Hussein. O Allah, accept all of our good deeds. O Allah, forgive all of our sins. O Allah, answer all of our hajat. O Allah, give us the strength to be in your obedience. O Allah, give us the courage to stay away from your disobedience. O Allah, keep us with the Ahlul Bayt in this world and the hereafter. O Allah, we pray to you for all those who are sick, for you to grant them a complete and a quick recovery. O Allah, all those who are suffering around the world, O Allah, bring peace and harmony to their lands. O Allah, remove the tyrants and the oppressors from their lands. O Allah, we pray to you to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Imam. O Allah, make us that community that is going to pave the way for the coming of the Imam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.